If the rotor won't turn, it's not because it's broken. It's because you're listening to the wrong thing. The voice cut through the heat like a blade, low and steady, but no one paid attention. The tarmac shimmered under the late afternoon sun, waves of heat rising off the concrete in thick, wavering distortions. The one Huey sat motionless at the center of it all, its long rotor blades sagging like tired limbs, casting thin shadows that stretched across the ground. Around it, a cluster of technicians moved with sharp, frustrated energy, boots scraping, tools clinking, voices layered with irritation. Kyle Kramer wiped a streak of grease across his jaw as he stepped back from the open engine panel, shaking his head. 6 hours, he muttered, louder this time, kicking the landing skid with a hollow thud. 6 hours, and this thing's still dead. A few of the younger techs chuckled, though the sound carried no humor, only tension. Laptops sat open on folding tables nearby, screens glowing green with system diagnostics that all told the same story. Everything was functioning. Every circuit, every sensor, every subsystem reported nominal. And yet the helicopter refused to come alive. Lieutenant Aaron Wells stood with his arms crossed, posture rigid, eyes flicking between the aircraft and his watch. "We've got 8 minutes," he said, voice tight, controlled. The general's demonstration flight doesn't wait for excuses. His gaze shifted toward the distant viewing stand where rows of empty seats sat beneath a shaded canopy, reserved for officials who would arrive any moment. The silence from the Huey felt heavier with each passing second, like the machine itself was resisting them. Kramer exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "It's not us," he snapped. "The system says it's fine. We've checked everything twice." "Then check it again," Wells replied, the edge in his tone unmistakable. Behind them, just beyond the circle of movement and noise, an old man stood alone. His presence was quiet, almost absorbed by the glare and the dust, but he didn't look lost. He wore faded jeans and a weathered olive jacket, the fabric creased and softened by decades of wear. His hands rested loosely at his sides, fingers still, as his pale blue eyes traced the lines of the helicopter with unsettling focus. He wasn't watching the technicians. He was watching the aircraft, listening to it in a way none of them understood. A dry wind moved across the tarmac, tugging lightly at his jacket, carrying with it the faint scent of fuel and hot metal. The distant hum of generators blended with the restless shuffle of boots, but beneath it all, there was something missing, something that should have been there. Kramer noticed him first, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Hey," he called out, gesturing with a grease-stained glove. "This is a restricted area." The old man didn't respond immediately. His gaze lingered on the rotor hub, as if measuring something invisible, something beyond torque specs and diagnostic codes. Wells followed Kramer's line of sight, his expression hardening. "Sir," he said, stepping forward, the words stripped of any real respect, "you can't be here." The old man finally shifted his eyes toward him. Calm, unbothered. "I'm not here for you," he said quietly. The words didn't challenge. They didn't argue. They simply existed, heavy in the air between them. Kramer let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Then you're definitely in the wrong place." A few technicians smirked, the tension briefly easing as their attention shifted away from the stubborn machine. But the Huey remained silent. The rotor didn't move. The air didn't change. And the countdown kept ticking. Wells checked his watch again. 6 minutes. Somewhere beyond the tarmac, the distant rumble of approaching vehicles began to rise, low and steady, like thunder rolling in from the horizon. The demonstration was coming, and the helicopter was still dead. The sound of engines grew louder in the distance, a convoy approaching fast, tires whispering against asphalt. But on the tarmac the Huey remained stubbornly still, its silence now louder than any machine that should have been running. Lieutenant Wells straightened, tension tightening his shoulders as he turned back to Kramer. 5 minutes, he said, sharper now, the words landing like pressure instead of information. Kramer exhaled through his teeth and grabbed a tablet, swiping through diagnostics again as if the answer might suddenly reveal itself if he looked hard enough. "Fuel pressure is stable, ignition is live, electrical is clean," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "There is nothing wrong with this aircraft." The old man shifted slightly, his boots scraping softly against the concrete, a small sound that somehow cut through the noise around them. His eyes remained fixed on the helicopter, tracking along the rotor mast, down the fuselage, pausing near a panel just below the exhaust. "You are reading numbers," he said quietly. Kramer let out a short laugh without looking at him. "Yeah, that is how this works." A few of the technicians smirked again, relieved to have something simple to dismiss. Wells glanced at the old man, irritation flickering. "Sir, you need to leave. Now." The old man did not move. The wind shifted again, brushing past the aircraft, rattling something faintly inside the frame, a soft metallic whisper that disappeared as quickly as it came. His head tilted just slightly, as if catching the echo of it. "You did not open that panel," he said. Kramer froze for half a second, then shook his head. "Because there is no reason to open it," he replied, stepping closer, voice tightening. "Every sensor behind it is green. Breaking a factory seal for no fault is how you create problems, not fix them." The old man's gaze remained steady. "The system does not hear what I hear." Kramer turned fully now, frustration boiling over. "And what exactly do you hear, old-timer? The spirit of the machine." A few of the younger techs laughed louder this time, the tension spilling out into mockery. Wells did not laugh. He watched the old man more carefully now, something about the stillness not fitting the situation. "For minutes," Wells said under his breath, glancing toward the approaching vehicles, now visible beyond the far end of the runway, dark silhouettes moving with purpose. The old man reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. The surface was cracked, edges darkened with age, the snap polished smooth from years of use. The simple motion seemed to pull the air tighter around him. Kramer scoffed, shaking his head. "What is that supposed to do?" The old man did not answer. His fingers rested on the pouch for a moment, thumb brushing across the worn leather as if it held more than tools, as if it carried memory. For just a second, the noise of the tarmac seemed to fade around him. The heat, the voices, the pressure, all of it dimmed beneath something older, something steadier. Then he looked back at the helicopter. "You missed it," he said. Wells took a step forward. "Missed what?" The old man lifted his hand, pointing toward the panel beneath the exhaust, the same place his eyes had lingered before. "That plate is not sitting right." Kramer walked over immediately, running his hand across the metal, pressing flat against it, checking the alignment. "It is perfectly flush," he snapped. "Torque is exact." The old man watched him without blinking. "It should not be." The words hung there, quiet but unshakable, as the low rumble of engines behind them grew closer, and the weight of the moment pressed in from all sides. The words did not land like an argument. They landed like a certainty, and for a moment no one spoke. The heat pressed down harder, the distant convoy now close enough that the low rumble of engines vibrated faintly through the concrete beneath their boots. Kramer stepped back from the panel, irritation sharpening into something closer to anger. "It is aligned," he said, louder now, as if volume could reinforce correctness. "I checked it myself." The old man did not raise his voice. "You checked what the system told you to check. That was enough." Kramer let out a sharp breath and turned to Wells. "Sir, we are wasting time. This is not helping." Wells hesitated, his eyes flicking once more toward the approaching vehicles, then back to the helicopter, then to the old man. Something about the man's stillness did not match the chaos around them. It was not defiance. It was not confusion. It was certainty. 3 minutes, Wells said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The number hung in the air like a ticking clock no one could stop. The old man stepped forward for the first time, slow, deliberate, each movement measured. The technicians instinctively shifted back, not out of respect, but out of uncertainty, as if something about his pace disrupted their rhythm. He stopped beside the aircraft, close enough now that the heat radiating off the metal shimmered against his jacket. His hand hovered near the panel, but did not touch it. Not yet. His eyes traced the edges, the bolts, the seams, seeing something none of the screens had shown. The world around him seemed to narrow, the noise fading again, replaced by something older, something buried beneath time. The glare of the tarmac softened in his mind, replaced by a different light, filtered through thick air, heavy and still. The sound of distant engines shifted, not modern, not controlled, but rhythmic, uneven, alive. A memory pressed forward, uninvited but unmistakable. The same shape of a helicopter, but younger, louder, straining against forces no machine was built to endure. The air carried weight, tension, urgency that could not be measured by any system. His fingers tightened slightly, remembering. Not the numbers. Not the diagnostics. The feeling. The way a machine spoke when it was about to fail, not through alarms, but through the smallest imperfections. He blinked once, and the present snapped back into place. The heat returned. The voices returned. The pressure returned. But something had changed. He reached out and tapped lightly along the edge of the panel, a soft metallic click that echoed differently than the others. Once. Twice. The second sound was just slightly off, barely noticeable, but enough. There, he said. Kramer frowned, stepping closer despite himself. That is nothing. The old man shook his head once. It is not nothing. Wells stepped in, closer now, his authority still present but no longer absolute. Explain it. The old man glanced at him briefly, then back at the aircraft. The panel is too perfect, he said. It is sealed like it has never been touched. But this aircraft has been flying. It breathes. It shifts. Metal expands, contracts. It never sits this still. Kramer crossed his arms, defensive, but the edge in his posture had softened, just slightly. So what are you saying? The old man's eyes did not leave the panel. I am saying something behind it is not moving when it should. The convoy engines roared louder now, vehicles turning onto the tarmac, closing the distance fast. The demonstration was seconds away from becoming a failure in front of everyone who mattered. Wells felt the weight of it settle fully on his shoulders. He looked at Kramer, then back at the old man. The decision sat there, heavy, irreversible. Then Wells exhaled slowly. Open it. Kramer froze. Sir, that breaks protocol. Wells did not look at him. So does failing in front of a general. Silence followed, thick and immediate. Kramer hesitated, then reached for his tools, the confidence in his movements no longer as sharp as before. And just behind them, unnoticed by most, a young airman named Daniel Cruz stood perfectly still, watching the old man with a growing sense that something far bigger than a broken machine was unfolding right in front of them. Kramer's wrench hovered for a fraction of a second before making contact, the metal clicking softly against the bolts as if the aircraft itself resisted the intrusion. The usual confidence in his hands was gone, replaced by something tighter, more deliberate. He loosened the first bolt, then the second, each turn slower than the last. Around him, the noise of the approaching convoy grew louder, engines rolling across the tarmac, doors beginning to slam in the distance. Time was no longer slipping. It was closing in. Lieutenant Wells stood rigid, eyes locked on the panel, as if willing it to reveal something before it was too late. Hurry it up, he said, but the edge in his voice had changed. It was no longer authority. It was pressure. Kramer pulled the panel free, stepping back as a wave of heat escaped from inside the compartment, carrying with it the faint scent of metal and something older, something worn. He leaned in immediately, scanning the components, his eyes moving fast, trained, precise. Everything looks normal, he said, but there was hesitation now, a small crack in the certainty that had defined him minutes ago. The old man stepped closer, close enough now that the shadow of the rotor blade passed over him, thin and shifting. He did not rush. He did not lean in with urgency. He simply looked. His eyes moved slowly across the interior, ignoring the obvious, passing over wires, connectors, systems that all appeared exactly as they should. Then he stopped, his gaze fixed on a small linkage tucked deeper inside, partially obscured, something easy to miss if you were not looking for it. He reached into his jacket again and opened the worn leather pouch, the snap releasing with a soft, familiar click that seemed to echo louder than it should. Inside were simple tools, old, unpolished, shaped by use rather than design. He selected one without hesitation. Kramer watched him now, no longer laughing, no longer dismissing, but not yet understanding. You are not seriously going to, he began, but the words faded before they could finish. The old man extended the tool into the compartment, his hand steady, precise, as if guided by memory rather than sight. He adjusted something small, almost invisible, a movement so slight it barely registered. A faint metallic shift followed, subtle but distinct. He withdrew his hand and stepped back. Close it, he said. Kramer blinked, caught between instinct and disbelief. That is it. The old man met his eyes for the first time. That was always it. The convoy had arrived now, black vehicles lined in a sharp row, doors opening in synchronized motion. Figures stepped out, uniforms crisp, presence heavy, the air shifting with their arrival. Wells straightened instantly, the weight of rank approaching like a storm. "Close it," he repeated louder now. Kramer moved quickly, securing the panel, his hands faster but less certain than before. The last bolt tightened just as the sound of footsteps approached behind them, measured, deliberate, unmistakable. The old man stepped back into the same quiet position he had held before, as if nothing had happened. The helicopter remained still for a heartbeat longer, the silence stretching, fragile. Then Wells looked at Kramer. "Start it." Kramer swallowed, turning toward the cockpit, the doubt now fully present in his movements. His hand hovered over the controls for a brief moment before he engaged the sequence. The system responded instantly. A low hum rolled through the aircraft, deep and steady, followed by the first slow rotation of the rotor blades. One turn, then another. The sound built, rising, filling the air, replacing the silence with something alive, something undeniable. Dust lifted from the tarmac in a widening circle, the heat breaking apart under the force of movement. Kramer stared, frozen, as the machine came to life under his hands, his earlier certainty collapsing into quiet disbelief. Wells did not speak. He did not move. He simply watched. And just beyond them, the first of the arriving officers stopped mid-step, eyes fixed on the helicopter, then shifting slowly toward the old man standing beside it, as if recognizing something the rest of them had only just begun to understand. The rotor gained speed, each rotation smoother than the last, the sound deepening into a steady, powerful rhythm that rolled across the tarmac and pushed the heat outward in visible waves. Dust lifted in spirals around the aircraft, scattering light and shadow across the ground, as if the machine itself had reclaimed control of the air. Kramer stepped back from the cockpit slowly, his hand still hovering near the controls, his expression caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. "That is not possible," he said under his breath, though no one answered. Lieutenant Wells stood rigid, eyes locked on the helicopter, but his focus was no longer on the machine. It shifted, slowly, toward the old man. Eli Vance had not moved. He stood just outside the widening circle of wind, jacket fluttering lightly, his gaze calm, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The approaching officers closed the distance now, their footsteps deliberate against the concrete, their presence carrying a weight that silenced what little noise remained among the technicians. Conversations died instantly. Movement slowed. Even the sound of the rotor seemed to settle into the background as attention shifted. A tall figure stepped forward from the group, his uniform marked with rank that required no introduction. General Michelson did not look at the helicopter first. His eyes moved past it, scanning the scene with sharp precision, taking in the open panel now sealed again, the scattered tools, the stunned expressions, and finally, the old man standing quietly at the edge of it all. For a brief moment, everything held still. The wind from the rotor tugged at uniforms and jackets, but no one adjusted, no one spoke. The general took another step forward, his gaze narrowing slightly as recognition flickered beneath the surface. "Who authorized this repair?" he asked, his voice controlled, but carrying across the space with unmistakable authority. Wells opened his mouth, but the words hesitated, caught between protocol and truth. Kramer glanced toward him, then toward the old man, uncertainty now fully replacing the confidence he had carried all day. "Sir, we identified a potential issue," Wells began, but the general's attention had already shifted. His eyes settled fully on Eli Vance. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but those closest to him felt it immediately. The tension in his posture eased, not into relaxation, but into something deeper, something like respect. "Vance," the general said, the name spoken without question, without doubt. It was not a guess. It was recognition. A ripple moved through the group, small but undeniable. Kramer blinked, the name landing heavier than any explanation could have. Wells straightened instinctively, the weight of the moment settling in. Eli did not react immediately. He simply met the general's gaze, calm, steady, as if this was not the first time their paths had crossed, and perhaps not the last. "It has been a while, sir," Eli said quietly. The general took another step closer, stopping just short of the rotor's outer edge, the wind pulling at his uniform but not breaking his focus. For a second, the distance between them seemed to carry years, unspoken and unseen. Then the general gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Not long enough," he replied. No one around them spoke. No one moved. The technicians who had filled the space with noise and certainty now stood silent, their earlier confidence stripped away by a reality they had not been prepared to face. Kramer lowered his gaze slightly, the weight of what he had witnessed settling deeper with each passing second. Wells remained at attention, but his understanding had shifted, the situation no longer defined by procedure or control. The helicopter continued to run smoothly behind them, the steady rhythm of the rotor no longer a problem to solve, but a presence that confirmed something far greater. And in the center of it all stood a man who had not argued, had not explained, had not demanded to be heard, but had simply acted, leaving behind a silence that carried more weight than any words could have filled. The wind from the rotor pressed harder now, flattening loose fabric, tugging at sleeves and collars, but no one stepped back. The machine had found its rhythm, a steady pulse that filled the air with purpose, yet all attention remained fixed on the space between the general and the old man. General Michaelson's eyes did not waver. They studied Eli Vance not as a curiosity, not as an interruption, but as something already known, already measured long before this moment. "You still carry it," the general said quietly, his voice lower now, no longer projecting for the crowd, but directed with precision. Eli's hand moved slightly toward his jacket, fingers brushing the edge of the worn leather pouch without opening it. "I do," he replied. The general gave a faint nod, as if that answer confirmed more than anyone else in the area could understand. Around them, the officers who had arrived stood in silence, their posture shifting subtly, not from command, but from recognition. One by one, their attention moved from the helicopter to Eli, their expressions tightening, sharpening, as if aligning with a truth that had just surfaced. Kramer felt it before he understood it. The atmosphere had changed again, but this time it was not tension. It was, wait. He glanced at the other technicians, expecting confusion, but what he saw instead was something quieter. Uncertainty. Respect, creeping in where dismissal had been. Lieutenant Wells remained still, but his stance had adjusted almost imperceptibly, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, as if instinct had taken over where protocol had failed. The general turned his head slightly, addressing no one and everyone at the same time. "This aircraft," he said, his tone calm but carrying, "should not have been grounded for 6 hours." No one answered. The statement was not an accusation. It was a fact. His gaze returned to Eli. And yet it was. Eli did not respond. He did not need to. The truth was already standing in front of them, spinning above them, echoing through the steady beat of the rotor. The general took a slow step closer, closing the distance further, the wind from the helicopter pulling at the edges of his uniform, but failing to move him. "Do you remember the first time you heard one fail before anyone else did?" he asked. The question seemed simple, but it carried depth that reached far beyond the moment. Eli's eyes shifted briefly toward the helicopter, then back to the general. "It was never the sound," he said. "It was what was missing." The words settled into the space, quiet but heavy. Kramer felt them more than he understood them, a realization forming at the edge of his thoughts, something about all the data, all the readings, all the systems that had told him everything was fine while something essential had been wrong. Daniel Cruz stood a few steps behind, unmoving, his eyes fixed on Eli, replaying every second from earlier in his mind. The stillness, the certainty, the way he had seen what no one else had even thought to question. Cruz swallowed, the weight of it settling deep, a realization that what he had witnessed was not luck, not instinct alone, but something built over years he could not yet comprehend. The general turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the technicians now, sharp again, controlled. "You rely on systems," he said. "He relies on understanding." No one moved. No one spoke. The difference between those two things hung in the air, undeniable. Then the general stepped back just enough to gesture subtly toward the helicopter, still running smooth and steady behind them. "The demonstration will proceed," he said. The words were simple, but they carried resolution, authority, and something more. A quiet acknowledgement of who had made that possible. Eli Vance said nothing. He did not look at the helicopter again. He did not look at the technicians. He simply stood, the wind moving around him, as if the moment had already passed for him, even while it was just beginning for everyone else. The rotor's rhythm deepened into a steady thunder, no longer struggling, no longer hesitant, each rotation cutting cleanly through the air with a confidence that had been absent only minutes before. The demonstration had begun without ceremony, the aircraft lifting slightly on its skids, stabilizing as if it had never been grounded at all. The officials who had arrived now stood watching from a measured distance, their expressions composed, but their attention anchored to a point that was no longer the helicopter. It was the man who had made it fly again. Kramer remained where he was, unmoving, his hands hanging at his sides, the grease on his fingers now forgotten. His eyes tracked the aircraft instinctively, checking, verifying, searching for flaws that were no longer there. Every system reading he had trusted had told him the machine was fine, and yet it had not moved. Now it moved perfectly, and he had no data to explain why. The realization settled heavily in his chest, not as failure, but as limitation. Lieutenant Wells took a slow breath, the rigid control in his posture still present, but something beneath it had shifted. He was no longer standing over the situation. He was standing within it, aware now of a layer he had not accounted for. His gaze moved once more to Eli Vance, not with authority, but with recognition. Daniel Cruz stood a few paces back, his heart still beating faster than the moment required, his mind replaying the sequence again and again. The panel, the sound, the certainty. He had followed procedure his entire career, trusted systems, trusted structure, but what he had just witnessed did not fit into any manual he had studied. It did not replace what he knew. It expanded it. The general turned slightly, watching the aircraft rise a few feet higher, stable, controlled, responding exactly as it should. A faint, almost imperceptible shift crossed his expression, something close to satisfaction, but it did not last long. His attention returned to Eli. "You always leave before anyone asks you to stay," he said, his voice quieter now, almost lost beneath the rotor wash. Eli gave a small nod, the movement barely noticeable. "That was never my place," he replied. The general studied him for a moment longer, then exhaled slowly, as if accepting something he had already known. It should have been. The words carried no command, no demand, only truth. Around them, the technicians began to move again, but more carefully now, their energy tempered, their voices lower. No one laughed. No one dismissed. The space had changed, and they felt it even if they could not fully explain it. Kramer stepped forward slightly, hesitating before speaking, the confidence that once came easily now replaced by something more deliberate. "Sir," he said, addressing Eli, the word carrying a different weight than before. Eli turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. Kramer paused, searching for the right words, something that could bridge the gap between what he had believed and what he had just witnessed. "How did you know?" he asked finally, the question simple, but genuine. Eli looked at him for a moment, then back toward the helicopter, now hovering steady against the bright sky. "You were listening for what the system could tell you," he said. "I was listening for what it could not." Kramer nodded slowly, the answer settling deeper than any technical explanation could have. It was not a rejection of what he knew. It was a reminder that it was not everything. The general turned away slightly, signaling to his staff with a subtle gesture, the demonstration continuing as planned, but the moment that mattered had already passed. Eli Vance adjusted his jacket lightly as the wind moved around him, then stepped back, just beyond the edge of the activity once more. No announcement marked his departure. No one called attention to it. But those who had seen, who had understood even a fraction of what had happened, did not forget where he had been standing. The helicopter climbed higher now, steady and controlled, its shadow sliding across the tarmac like a dark echo of what had just unfolded below. The demonstration continued with precision, the pilot guiding the aircraft through smooth, deliberate movements that drew quiet nods from the gathered officials. But the center of gravity had shifted. It was no longer in the air. It had been on the ground, in a moment most of them had almost missed. Eli Vance moved away from the edge of the operation without drawing attention, his steps unhurried, his posture unchanged. The wind from the rotors softened as he stepped beyond its reach, replaced by the ordinary sounds of the base, distant vehicles, muted voices, the low hum of equipment returning to the background. Behind him, the technicians resumed their positions, but nothing about their movement was the same. Kramer stood for a moment longer, watching Eli's retreating figure, something unsettled in his chest that had nothing to do with failure. It was the realization that there had been a layer of understanding he had never considered, something that could not be downloaded, measured, or simulated. He turned slowly toward Wells. "Sir," he said, quieter now, "we would have never found that." Wells did not answer immediately. His eyes followed Eli as well, narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought. "No," he said finally. "We would not have." The words carried no frustration, no blame, only clarity. Daniel Cruz shifted his weight, the tension that had been building inside him finally settling into something else. Resolve. He stepped forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on the space Eli had just left. "Sir," he said, addressing Wells, "should we log what happened?" Wells considered the question, his expression tightening for a brief moment. Procedures required documentation. Systems required explanation. But what had just occurred did not fit cleanly into either. "Log the repair," Wells said at last. "But do not pretend we understand it completely." Cruz nodded once, the answer aligning with what he had already begun to feel. Not everything that mattered could be reduced to a line in a report. Near the convoy, General Michelson remained still, his attention now split between the aircraft in motion and the man who had already begun to disappear into the ordinary background of the base. One of his aides stepped closer, speaking in a low voice about the schedule, the next phase of the demonstration, the expectations waiting ahead. The general listened, but only partially. His eyes tracked Eli for one last moment before he spoke. "Make sure he is not stopped on his way out," he said quietly. The aide hesitated, surprised by the specificity, then nodded. "Yes, sir." The general gave a faint nod, then turned his attention fully back to the demonstration, his posture returning to its formal precision, but the shift had already been made. Behind him, a few of the senior officers exchanged brief glances, subtle but meaningful, the kind that passed understanding without words. They had seen enough. Kramer finally moved, picking up his tools, but his hands were slower now, more deliberate. He glanced once more at the panel that had been opened and closed, the place where everything had changed. It looked the same. Perfect. Seamless. Exactly as it had before. But it was not the same. He knew that now, and he would never look at it the same way again. Farther down the tarmac, Eli Vance reached the edge of the active area, the sounds of the demonstration fading behind him. He did not look back. He did not need to. The work was done. The machine was alive. And the lesson, whether anyone chose to acknowledge it or not, had already taken hold in the silence he left behind. The sound of the helicopter faded into the distance, its steady rhythm dissolving into the wide, open sky until it became just another distant hum among many. The tarmac slowly returned to its usual tempo, voices rising again, footsteps resuming, systems resetting back into their familiar order. But something had shifted beneath it all, something quieter, harder to measure, yet impossible to ignore for those who had witnessed it. Kramer stood beside the aircraft long after the moment had passed, his tools resting untouched at his side. He reached out once, almost without thinking, placing his hand lightly against the metal near the panel that had been opened. It felt the same. Smooth. Solid. Exactly as it should. But now he understood that what he had trusted before had been incomplete. Not wrong. Just incomplete. He pulled his hand back slowly, his gaze drifting across the helicopter as if seeing it for the first time. Not as a collection of systems and readouts, but as something that carried history, nuance, behavior that could not always be captured in numbers. Lieutenant Wells moved with measured steps, issuing quiet instructions, ensuring the demonstration continued without interruption, but his voice carried a different tone now. Less rigid, more aware. He paused briefly, looking toward the far end of the tarmac where Eli Vance had disappeared from view. For a moment, the space felt larger, emptier, as if something important had just passed through and left no trace behind except understanding. Daniel Cruz stood near the edge of the activity, a tablet in his hands, the report screen open but untouched. He stared at the blinking cursor, the empty space waiting for explanation. He could document the panel, the adjustment, the restart sequence, but none of that captured what had actually happened. He exhaled slowly, then began to type, choosing each word carefully, not to explain everything, but to record enough to remember that there had been more beneath the surface. Near the convoy, General Michelson stood with his staff, the formal structure of command reassembling around him as the demonstration concluded. An aide spoke quietly about schedules, briefings, the next location, but the general's gaze drifted once more toward the edge of the base. Just for a second. Then it returned, focused, controlled. Proceed, he said, his voice steady, carrying authority once more. The moment had passed, but it had not been lost. Far from the center of activity, beyond the hum of engines and the rhythm of procedure, Eli Vance walked along the outer edge of the base, his pace unhurried, his expression unchanged. The noise behind him faded with each step, replaced by the quieter sounds of open space, distant wind, the faint rustle of dry grass along the perimeter. He reached into his jacket briefly, adjusting the worn leather pouch, then let his hand fall back to his side. No one stopped him. No one called after him, and he did not expect them to. The sky stretched wide above, clear and open, the kind of sky that had seen machines rise and fall for decades, long before systems became trusted, long before everything could be measured. Eli did not look back. He had already seen what mattered. Back on the tarmac, the helicopter returned smoothly to the ground, its mission complete, its performance flawless. Applause came, measured and respectful, but it carried none of the weight of what had truly defined the day. That had happened earlier, in a moment most of them had not understood until it was over. And for those who had seen it, who had felt it, the lesson remained long after the sound of the rotor had faded. Not everything that keeps a machine alive can be found in a system. Some things are learned in silence, carried in memory, and recognized only by those who have listened long enough to hear what others cannot. Machines evolve. Mastery does not.